Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of Scraps and Locos of Britain. Each week we'll take a look at a class of locomotives that didn't make it into preservation. All of these classes will be standard gauge and owned by either a pre-grouping railway company, one of the big four railway companies, and or British Railways. While some classes will get a new build number, most of these classes will be scrapped and likely remain scrapped. Here we go. Our next episode is on the Great Western's Night Owls. In 1901, George Jackson Churchward envisioned a 460 with 5'8" driving wheels based on his Saints. This never came to fruition, and so instead, in 1911, Churchward introduced the 4300 class 260 Moguls. Although the 4300s proved to be very successful on both freight and passenger duties, by the end of the First World War, the GWR realized that the 4300s were starting to struggle with the demands being placed on them, particularly on fast freight trains. Rather than going back for the original proposal for a 460, Churchward decided to design a 280 version of the 4300s. The prototype, number 4700, was outshot from Swindon in May 1919. She was the last locomotive to be designed by Churchward. Number 4700 had the same 5'8" driving wheels as the 4300s and initially the same 225 pounds per square inch Swindon number 1 boiler as used on the 2800s, the aforementioned Saints, and the 4000 class 460s, known as Stars. The cylinders were 19 by 30 inches, half an inch larger than those in the 2800s and 4300s, and the tractive effort was 30,459 pounds. Unfortunately, the Swindon number 1 boiler was too small for number 4700. Churchward knew this from the get-go, but he had to use the number 1 boiler because none of the other boilers would be long enough for such a locomotive. After only 2 years of work, number 4700 was sidelined in 1921 and rebuilt with a new boiler from Swindon. Known as the Swindon number 7 type boiler, it had the same barrel length as the Swindon number 1 type, 14 feet 10 inches. But the minimum diameter of the boiler was 5'6" inches, the same diameter being the maximum for the Swindon number 1 type. The maximum diameter for the number 7 boiler was 6 feet. However, the boiler pressure was still 225 psi. As well as a larger smoke box and a modified boiler, number 4700 also received outside steam pipes and modified snifting valves. With all of these modifications, number 4700 proved to be much more successful. She proved to be so successful that 8 more members, numbered 4701 to 4708, were ordered from Swindon in 1921. By the time that the number 4701 was outshot from Swindon in January 1922, Churchward had already retired and been replaced by Charles Collett. Between February and April 1922, numbers 4702 to 4705 rolled off the production line at Swindon. Production was delayed for another 11 months, with the final 3 members appearing between March and April 1923. Interestingly enough, Charles Collett initially wanted to use the standard number 7 boiler on his Castle class 460s, but this was later dropped because Collett was concerned that locomotives would be heavier than the maximum allowable axle loading of just 20 tons. Most of these routes were classed as red, meaning that they could accommodate any locomotive with an axle loading of up to 20 tons. The 4700s had an axle loading of 19 tons and 12 hundredweight, 2 hundredweight less than the Castle. However, with such a high axle loading, they were banned from working over secondary routes in which the 4300s could traverse. When the 4700s were introduced, they stole the title of heaviest locomotives in the GWR from the county 440s. And as mentioned in my video on Churchward's counties, this was ultimately stolen by the King Class 460s. Because of the class's axle loading, the 4700s had a low mileage and limited usefulness. Despite this, the 4700s could still be put to good use, often being used on the fast overnight freight trains around London Paddington, the West Country, and the West Midlands. This earned the class's nickname of Night Owls. As well as these duties, the class was also employed onto passenger service, particularly summer holiday excursions. The only other 280s that regularly hauled passenger trains in service in Britain were the Somerset and Dorset 7Fs. Along with the Castles, during the 1930s, the 4700s also received larger tenders from 3,500 gallons to 4,000 gallons. This arrangement was also applied to the 4900 class 460s, known as Halls. In 1936, Collett picked up Churchward's initial proposal for a 460 with 5'8" driving wheels. Using parts from 100 of the 4300s, he produced the 6800 class 460s, known as Granges. In 1938, he produced a much smaller 460 designed for secondary routes. This was the 7800 class, known as Manners. Following the introduction of the Granges, it became more common to see the 4700s on express passenger trains and summer excursions. All of the Night Owls made it through World War II and into British Railways days. By the 1950s, the Night Owls were seen more and more commonly on summer excursions around the western region. Because of this, all 8 of the Night Owls were repainted green during overhaul at Swindon in the late 1950s. Allocations included Old Oak Common, Exeter, Birkenhead, and Plymouth Lara. By the 1960s, the class had 2 members allocated to Southall Shed, while the rest were based at Old Oak Common. The introduction of diesel hydraulics to the western region led to the first withdrawal of number 4702 going from Southall in June 1962. Despite the class's low mileage, number 4705 managed to clock 1,656,564 miles before being withdrawn from Old Oak Common in December 1963. By 1964, only 4 of the Old Oak Common allocations remained, and the last 3 to go were numbers 4703, 4704, and 4707 in May of that year. Surprisingly, only numbers 4702 and 4706 were scrapped at the place that they were built. 5, including the last 3 Old Oak Common examples, were cut up at A. King & Son Limited in Norwich, whilst number 4708 was cut up at Cashmore's Great Bridge. The class was officially made extinct when number 4701 was scrapped at Cashmore's of Newport on the 31st of August, 1965, 4 months before the end of steam on the western region of British Railways. However, the Great Western Society is constructing the next member, number 4709, using new parts and parts recovered from 3 locomotives of the Barry 10. These parts include the cylinder block and smoke box saddle block from 2800 number 2861, 6 of the driving wheels, and the frame extension from 5101 Large Prairie number 4115, and the axle boxes, 4th axle, horns, and other miscellaneous parts from 5205 number 5227. Initially, the project was based at the Llangollen Railway, alongside many other new build projects that I will mention in future episodes. However, in April 2020, the project moved from Llangollen to Leaky Finders near Exeter. Progress has been slow recently due to COVID-19, but things are expected to pick up in August. At the time of writing, the cylinder block, saddle block, front buffers, chassis, spring hanger bolts have been completed, with work starting on the boiler in tender. The Great Western Society hopes that number 4709 will be put on its wheels by the end of 2020. The locomotive is expected to be completed by either 2023 or 2024, with the steaming date set for the latter. This episode was inspired by Locomotives of Great Britain by Rail, Air, Land and Sea, and Top 10 Extinct British Steam Locomotives by Pendennis Castle. Links to both their channels and the Great Western Society's Night Owl project are in the description below. If you want to see a certain class of steam locomotives that's extinct and you'd like me to cover, let me know in the comments below. If you want to see more episodes, then feel free to subscribe. I shall see you next week when I look at the Fowler duct tanks for the LMS. Stay safe, everyone. Goodbye.